In 1823, the United States made a bold declaration that would shape an entire hemisphere for the next 2 centuries. The message to Europe was simple: stay out of the Americas. This became known as the Monroe Doctrine. Publicly, it was sold as a protective shield for the newly independent nations of Latin America, a warning to old empires not to recolonize them. But behind this promise of protection was a quiet, powerful ambition. The United States was positioning itself as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. At the time, Latin American countries were just finding their footing, having recently broken free from Spanish and Portuguese rule. Their independence was fragile. The Monroe Doctrine claimed to safeguard this new freedom, but it never treated these nations as equals. Instead, it framed the entire hemisphere as a single American sphere of influence. Europe was shut out, but Latin America was never truly invited in as a partner. For most of the 19th century, the US didn't have the military might to enforce this. Ironically, it was the British Royal Navy that kept other European powers at bay, mostly to protect its own trade interests. During this time, US influence grew not with soldiers, but with dollars through commerce, investment, and diplomacy. On paper, Latin American nations were independent, but in reality, they were becoming more and more economically dependent on their northern neighbor. The game changed completely in 1904 with the Roosevelt Corollary. President Theodore Roosevelt openly declared that the US had the right to intervene in Latin American affairs to prevent instability. This twisted the original doctrine from a defensive warning into an offensive policy. The US was no longer just protecting the region from outsiders. It was now claiming the right to police the region itself. What followed was a series of military occupations. US forces landed in Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. They seized customs houses, controlled national debts, and installed governments that were friendly to US interests. These actions were justified as necessary for bringing stability, but they consistently crushed local sovereignty. Order was defined by Washington, not by the people living there. Then came the Cold War, and the Monroe Doctrine found a new enemy: communism. Suddenly, any movement in Latin America that challenged US economic interests like land reform or labor rights could be labeled as a Soviet plot. This gave the US a new excuse to intervene, both openly and in secret. In 1954, a democratically elected government in Guatemala was overthrown with CIA backing. Similar stories unfolded in Brazil in 1964 and Chile in 1973. Intelligence agencies, economic pressure, and military aid were all used to manipulate politics from behind the scenes. Democracy was fine as long as it produced results that Washington approved of. By the end of the 20th century, sending in the Marines had become too controversial, so the tools of intervention evolved. Military force was replaced by economic warfare. Sanctions, trade pressure, and crushing debt became the new weapons of control. International financial institutions, heavily influenced by the US, imposed strict policies that limited the economic freedom of Latin American governments. Sovereignty was once again squeezed, not by soldiers, but by spreadsheets and loan agreements. Today, in the 21st century, the original contradiction of the Monroe Doctrine is clearer than ever. Latin American nations have diversified their partnerships, building strong ties with China, Europe, and other global players. In response, the old doctrine has been dusted off and selectively revived. When China invests in the region, it's framed as a security threat. When other global powers engage in diplomacy, it's called interference. But when the US exerts its own influence, it's called leadership. This reveals the doctrine's true nature. It was never really about protecting Latin America's independence. It was about ensuring that independence never got in the way of US dominance. Over 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine didn't just fade away. It adapted, it redefined sovereignty as obedience and painted resistance as instability. What began as a declaration against empire ultimately became the very framework for it. And that is how a promise of protection evolved into one of the most powerful and enduring instruments of American power. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing for more deep dives into history.